He should have come back down the trail by sunset. That was the deal, same as always. 2 hours in the field, meet back at checkpoint 7 just before the last convoy turned south. But the sun dropped, the tree line went still, and the jungle turned that kind of dark that doesn't just fall, it presses. No footsteps, no flash of light. No sound except the bugs coming alive in the heat. And the next morning, only the driver came back. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe if you've ever known someone who vanished into silence and never came home. Every click helps pull one more name back into the light. My name's Mark Henley. I was 42 when I took this case on, not as a cop, not as a relative, but as someone who's been collecting other people's unfinished stories my whole life. I'd grown up in Oregon watching old black and white movies where Thomas Carver always got the girl or the sword or the last laugh. But it wasn't Thomas's face that haunted me, it was his son's. Jack Carver. Jack wasn't an actor, never wanted to be, said he didn't care for pretend. He'd turned his back on Hollywood in the late 60s and picked up a camera instead, spent his 20s shooting real stories, war stories, Cambodia, Vietnam. He had that same squared jaw and easy stride his father made famous, but Jack used it to step closer to danger, not away from it. He was on contract with Time magazine by the time he was 27. He worked quiet, clean, sharp. No flash, no filters. He had this way of capturing a soldier's face just before the first shot, or a mother's hand over a child's ear, and that's how you knew it was him. By 1970, Jack had been bouncing between Vietnam and Cambodia for 2 years. He knew which roads you could take and which ones you didn't talk about. He wasn't reckless, but he didn't flinch either. Daniel Royce was his closest friend over there, another American with a press badge and more nerve than common sense. The two of them had ridden motorcycles into firefights more than once. They watched each other's backs, ate what they could find, slept with one boot on. But something changed that March. I found it in his last few telegrams, the ones he sent from Phnom Penh. His words got shorter. He stopped cracking those quiet jokes about how bad the coffee was. There's one line that stuck with me. He said, "If I don't send anything for a few days, I'm just somewhere I shouldn't be." At the time, the war was leaking over the Cambodian border fast. The North Vietnamese were hiding supply routes there, and U.S. forces were pushing in without officially admitting it. Everyone knew something big was about to hit. And Jack, he volunteered to be close when it did. April 6th, 1970. Jack and Daniel left the capital early, headed northeast toward a place called Snool. They hired a motorbike driver who knew the back trails and told him they'd be back by dark. They packed light cameras, film water. No weapons. That wasn't their job. The checkpoints thinned out the deeper they went. First South Vietnamese soldiers, then no one. Just trees, heat, and the tension that hums under your ribs when you're being watched. They passed the last checkpoint around 10:30 a.m. The guard remembered them both. Jack tall and quiet. His sleeves rolled his camera bag over one shoulder. Daniel grinned like always, asking which turn led to Snool. That checkpoint guard would be the last person to ever see them alive. The motorbike came back alone. Said there'd been gunfire near a place called Chi Phu. Said the road emptied like the jungle swallowed it. Said he turned around and never looked back. And that was it. No photos, no wreckage, no bodies. Just heat silence and questions that never stopped growing. I didn't know Jack Carver. Not personally. But I've carried his story long enough to feel like I do. And I'll tell you what finally pulled it all loose, what someone found buried under 30 years of jungle and heat and red soil. But first, I need you to understand the man behind the lens. Because he wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing truth. And the truth got him killed. The last confirmed sighting of Jack Carver and Daniel Royce was just past 10:30 that morning. They were heading east, deeper into the countryside, cameras strapped over their shoulders, jackets tied at the waist. The man at the final checkpoint said Jack looked calm, focused. He remembered how Jack kept his eyes on the road ahead, while Daniel made light conversation with the guards, flashing his press badge and asking how far to the next village. That guard, he's since passed away, told me once that he had a bad feeling. He said most journalists, even the brave ones, paused at that gate. Looked back. Jack didn't. And that's always stayed with me. The road between Phnom Penh and Snool was rough even on good days. Packed clay-overgrown edges, nothing but narrow trails threading through dense jungle. It passed through a shifting patchwork of controls South Vietnamese Cambodian government forces and long stretches under North Vietnamese and Viet Cong command. Everyone knew the area past Chi Phu was contested ground, but no map could tell you who really held it at any given moment. You had to read the signs: displaced brush, a quieted village, fresh boot tracks where there shouldn't be any. That motorbike driver Jack hired, his name's lost to time, but he knew the routes well. He was experienced, cautious. Probably the only reason he made it back alive. What we know about the hours that followed comes mostly from that man's statement. He said they passed through 4 informal stops where scattered troops waved them through without much question. They took the eastern bypass, avoiding a known ambush zone. Around noon, they reached a clearing outside Chi Phu where the road narrowed into jungle footpath. That's when he says they heard gunfire in the distance, sharp, irregular, not heavy yet. Jack and Daniel dismounted, checked their gear, and spoke quietly with the driver. He says Jack pointed toward the noise, then looked back just once and nodded. The driver waited 5 minutes, maybe 10. Then the trees snapped alive with shouting. He didn't see where the voices came from. He didn't see Jack or Daniel again. He just ran. When he got back to the checkpoint, the soldiers knew him. They believed him. And within hours, the word had spread. 2 American journalists missing near Chi Phu. No radio contact, no bodies. Just a single man back from the trail, pale and shaking, who kept saying he didn't know what went wrong. Time magazine launched their own search within days. They had a field office in Saigon and pulled every string they had. Local fixers, other correspondents, even old intelligence contacts still lingering after dark assignments. The military opened a file but moved slowly. Officially, Cambodia was off limits. Unofficially, everyone knew better. I spoke with one of the correspondents who worked that search. She told me the jungle swallowed things fast out there. Tracks didn't last, camps moved, villages emptied. You could walk through a clearing that looked untouched and be stepping on 3 weeks of history no one was left to tell. They tried to trace the route, but heavy rains came that week and washed out what little there was. South Vietnamese patrols swept the region but came up with nothing. No sign of struggle, no spent cartridges, no press badges dropped in the dirt. By mid-April, 2 full weeks after they vanished, the American embassy acknowledged their disappearance. But no one made a public statement. Not yet. It was too early, they said. These things happened. Journalists got detained, lost their way, resurfaced days later with wild stories. That's what people told themselves, that Jack and Daniel had gotten caught in the crossfire, maybe held by a local militia, maybe just waiting out the chaos until it was safe to emerge. But then May came, and June. No letters, no film, no rumors out of the camps. Nothing. That summer, Jack's stepmother, Carol Carver, flew to Phnom Penh. She was a former actress, once well known herself, and still held a certain presence when she walked into a room. I saw pictures of her in those weeks, button-down linen shirts, dark sunglasses, hair tied back. Always holding something. A folder. A photo. A press pass someone had found in a drawer. She visited the checkpoints, the press lodges, the embassies. She asked quiet questions. She didn't cry in front of cameras. She sat down with the Cambodian Foreign Ministry. She met with South Vietnamese officers. She even tried to track down the motorbike driver herself, though by then he'd vanished back into the provinces, probably scared. maybe worse. Nothing she did changed the facts. By September, the story had lost its shine in the international press. The war was escalating. American troops were being pulled and repositioned. Cambodia's own government was unraveling under pressure. Jack and Daniel became part of the war's background noise, a cautionary tale for new photographers heading into border zones. A line of warning in briefings. Don't go past Chi Fu. That's where the Carver boy disappeared. I still have copies of the last letters Jack sent his editor. One of them, dated March 28th, talks about the tone on the ground shifting. He says locals were quieter, avoiding eye contact. That checkpoints felt thinner, more performative. He wrote, "Something's moving, but nobody wants to say what." It wasn't just the jungle that swallowed him. It was the war itself, layered in silence and denial, and too many people pretending they didn't see what they did. In the end, the story went cold, not because people stopped caring, but because too many forces benefited from forgetting. A missing journalist is tragic, but a dead one captured on the wrong side of a border America wasn't supposed to be crossing, that was a problem. So the search folded into rumor. Rumor folded into silence, and silence in time became the only version people remembered. Except it wasn't the end. Not for Jack. Not for the ones who kept looking. Because 40 years later, in a different clearing beneath a tree, no one thought to mark someone would dig through that silence and find something still waiting. Something that had been buried, yes, but not forgotten. For a long time, it felt like I was the only one still asking questions. People nodded politely when I brought up the case when I mentioned Jack Carver's name, but behind their eyes was that flicker I'd come to recognize. The discomfort of someone who's already moved on. Even folks in the journalism world, people who'd worked alongside Jack and Daniel, eventually stopped chasing it. They called it tragic. A loss. They'd lower their voices, say, "It was wartime, you know," as if that explained anything. But I couldn't let it go. Because the more I read, the more I realized how quickly things had been folded into silence. There were reports filed, cursory ones, briefings that stopped just short of naming names, a handful of witness statements, some contradicting others, conveniently vague. Most frustrating of all, no real record of follow-up beyond the initial sweep. It was as if someone had opened a file, glanced inside, and quietly set it aside without ever reading the rest. When Carol Carver came back from Cambodia that first time, she held a press conference. Small quiet. No flashbulbs or networks. Just a few reporters, mostly local, and a couple correspondents who still remembered Jack's work. She stood behind the podium with her hands clasped in front of her and read from a short statement thanking those who had tried to help, expressing continued hope and asking for privacy. That was it. Afterward, someone asked if she believed Jack was still alive. She didn't answer right away. Just stared ahead for a few seconds, then said, "I believe we're owed the truth." I found that clip buried in a public archive years later. Played it more times than I'll admit. Because that phrase, that's what pulled me in. Not closure, not justice, just the truth. By the mid-1970s, the war was ending. American troops pulled out. Cambodia collapsed into something far worse under the Khmer Rouge. The region went dark. Jack and Daniel's disappearance was already fading from memory by then. Their families wrote letters, requested updates, reached out to embassies and advocacy groups, but no one answered. Time magazine, to their credit, did what they could. They sent a few more reporters to poke around Southeast Asia in the late 70s, trying to connect with displaced villagers or former militia members. But the trails were cold and the borders even colder. By then, thousands had disappeared. Jack and Daniel became names on a long list of the missing. What struck me most, though, was how many people quietly dismissed the possibility of foul play. Even people who'd known Jack personally leaned toward accident or miscommunication. Maybe they wandered into the wrong village, someone told me, or they just got caught in the crossfire. But the deeper I dug, the less that added up. There was no trace of their bodies, no gear recovered. And that motorbike driver, whatever you make of his story, never described chaos. He described a sudden shift. 1 minute they were walking down a path. The next, they were gone. He heard shouts, not gunfire. He didn't see them fall. He ran. That's all he could tell us. In 1982, I found an archived interview with a Cambodian refugee who had come through a processing center in Thailand. It wasn't about Jack or Daniel specifically, it was part of a larger oral history project. But there was one detail buried in the transcript that hit me like a punch. The man spoke about a jungle camp, a place where 2 white men had been held briefly in the early 1970s. One of them had a camera, he said. The guards took it. The man tried to hide a roll of film but was caught. The refugee said they were moved quickly after that, taken to another camp deeper inland. He never saw them again. I tried to verify the account, but the man had died a few years earlier. His name was recorded, but there was no forwarding contact for surviving family. Just a town listed, nothing more. Still, that was the first real mention I'd seen of 2 foreign men together matching Jack and Daniel's general description in the right time frame and region. I took it seriously, but when I brought it to the editor of a national outlet I was consulting for at the time, they brushed it off, said the source wasn't credible enough. No photos, no second witness. And they weren't wrong technically. But something about it stayed with me. The way the refugee described the camp, its layout, the guards, the way the men were separated from other prisoners. It had the ring of truth, even if it wasn't enough to publish. That became a pattern. A trickle of stories, unconfirmed, inconsistent, but eerily similar. Westerners seen in prison camps, cameras confiscated, men asking guards for pencils or paper. A woman claimed she'd met an American who spoke French and English and wrote things down in a notebook at night. That last detail stuck with me, because Jack was raised in France. He'd have known both languages, but when I tried to connect these accounts to get anyone to take them seriously, I hit wall after wall. Agencies told me the stories were outdated. Families were encouraged not to stir things up. One government contact, someone I'd worked with before, told me off the record that, quote, "You're chasing phantoms." He said that with a kind of weary finality, like a man warning me to stop asking before I found something I shouldn't. That was the first moment I suspected there might be more going on than just a disappearance. Still, no one wanted to follow it. Not formally, not publicly. People moved on. Papers stopped printing follow-ups. Families stopped giving interviews. But I kept everything. Every name, every statement, every half-buried thread. Because I'd started to notice something. The most detailed accounts, the ones that lined up even across countries, all came from refugees who passed through a specific corridor near the Vietnamese border. They spoke of multiple camps, always temporary, always hidden in dense jungle. And in at least 3 interviews I found between 1981 and 1985, there was one strange overlap. A description of a camera buried, not burned, not stolen. Buried. That detail never made the headlines. But I remembered it. And decades later, it would matter. Because when the jungle finally gave something back, that's exactly what was waiting. Not a confession, not a body, but a camera in the dirt, and something still inside it. After that 3rd refugee account came in with the same strange detail about the buried camera, always buried, never taken or burned. I stopped looking at those stories as coincidence. I started building a timeline, not just of Jack and Daniel's disappearance, but of the camps themselves, where they moved, what terrain they favored, which routes they abandoned. The war had been over for decades by then, but it still left behind these strange outlines, places where the trees grew back differently, where even now locals wouldn't farm or build. I mapped it all. I printed out satellite images and marked every village, every name I could find, tied to a prisoner sighting. It was obsessive, I'll admit that, but it was the only way I knew how to keep them from slipping through the cracks again. Some nights I'd sit in front of that wall of notes and photos and just stare, waiting for the pattern to speak. And eventually something did. It was a stretch of dense jungle north of Crotier, not far from where American and South Vietnamese forces had pushed in during 1970. Several refugee reports placed temporary prison camps in that area, always described as mobile hidden, surrounded by water on at least one side. The same region kept popping up in unrelated interviews, people describing strange comings and goings, new guards showing up, locals being warned to stay out after dusk. But what stuck out most was one particular name that surfaced from two very different sources nearly 10 years apart. A hill just west of a dried riverbed. In both cases, it was referred to only by its shape, the back of a dog's head. I circled it on the map, not because I knew what it meant, but because it was the only place that hadn't been paved over with guesses. The problem was, even by the early 2000s, the area was still dangerous. There were minefields, old ordnance, pockets of guerrilla fighters who never really disbanded. And even if someone wanted to help, they had no real reason to believe Jack Carver's story was buried out there. And that's when the isolation really set in. It's hard to explain, but when you hold on to a case this long, when the names have been quiet for decades and most people have turned the page, you start to feel the edges of your own certainty fray. I'd be lying if I said I didn't start doubting myself, not the facts, but the point of continuing. There was one night, I remember this clearly. I'd just gotten off the phone with a Cambodian contact who told me he couldn't assist anymore, said the money wasn't worth the risk, that the ghosts out there weren't just stories. I sat in the dark that night, the old files spread out on the kitchen table, and I caught myself thinking, maybe they were just killed on the road. Maybe we made it all bigger than it was because we needed to believe there was more. But then came the email. It was mid-October 2010. I opened my inbox expecting routine noise and found a message from a Canadian documentary filmmaker named Robert Grady. He'd been working in Cambodia for years, mostly focusing on post-war trauma and environmental collapse. But during an interview in a remote village near Stung Treng, he'd recorded an older farmer, unnamed at the time, who casually mentioned 2 American men who'd died in a camp nearby. What caught Robert's attention wasn't the story itself, but the way the man described the burial. He said one of the Americans had carried a metal eye that could freeze shadows. He said the soldiers had taken it, argued over it, then hidden it underground. Not to destroy it, but to come back for it later. Robert included a partial transcript in the email. I read it 3 times before I picked up the phone. He agreed to meet me in Phnom Penh. What followed wasn't fast. There were weeks of slow planning permits, local negotiations, field checks. Cambodia had opened up somewhat by then, but even in 2010 there were regions where you didn't go without a guide, and even then not without knowing who paid the guides. Robert had credibility, though. He knew the process, and more importantly, he knew how not to draw attention. In December, we made the trip north, first by truck, then motorbike, then on foot. The farmer was still alive. His name was Chan Dara, born 1948. He didn't remember dates, but he remembered faces. He said the taller one had blue eyes and a closed-mouth smile. He said the smaller one was the only person he'd ever seen try to photograph a guard and laugh at the same time. That's what he remembered. The laughter. How it didn't last. He led us out into the jungle with a piece of cloth tied to a stick. That's how he kept his bearings, he said. Not by trail, but by light. We hiked most of the day. The land grew dense, uneven. Parts had been flooded earlier that year, which made the ground soft and unpredictable. By late afternoon, he stopped under a tree with a wide, flat trunk and pointed to a mound just off-center from the roots. Said that was where the taller one's things were hidden. Not his body, just his things. We marked the location, photographed the site, and flagged it with biodegradable tape. Then we hiked out in silence. Over the next 3 months, we raised funds through quiet donors, mostly small journalism networks, and one foundation run by a retired war correspondent. In March, we returned with a team: 2 archaeologists, 1 interpreter, metal detection gear rated for low interference soil. On the 4th day of the dig, the detector went off near the spot Dara had pointed to. We uncovered the camera first. It was buried beneath almost 3 feet of compacted soil and tree roots wrapped in what looked like torn canvas and sealed in a rusted mess kit. It took half a day just to get it out without damaging the casing. The body was battered but intact. The serial number was legible, and just below it, half embedded in clay, were 2 worn film canisters. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just stared at that dirt for a long time. Because after 40 years of silence, something had finally surfaced. And whatever was on that film, whatever Jack had carried through that camp and buried with care, was waiting to speak. We transported the camera back to Phnom Penh under strict handling protocols. Minimal jostling, sealed containment, full chain of custody documented down to the hour. It wasn't about preserving a piece of vintage equipment. It was about what it might still hold inside. 40 years underground had done damage. There was rust along the film advance lever corrosion around the shutter housing. But it hadn't been destroyed, and in the right hands that meant it could still speak. We contacted a forensic imaging lab in California, people with experience restoring damaged media from disaster zones and conflict areas. They agreed to take it on. We packed the camera in layered foam, logged every handling step, and flew it out personally. No shipping label was ever going to touch that case. While we waited for word from the lab, we went back to the site. Not to dig, just to observe. There was something unfinished about the space. The metal detector team had flagged another signal about 15 yards from where the camera had been recovered. It wasn't as strong, but it was consistent and shaped like a long vertical band. We decided to excavate. The ground in that section was even denser. Root systems' decades-old leaf litter compressed into black clay. It took 2 full days to get down to anything solid. Then, just before dusk on the 3rd day, we found a small metal container. Rectangular, rusted, nearly shut. Inside were folded scraps of paper, decayed, clumped fragile, but paper all the same. We lifted the whole box out in one piece and wrapped it like it was evidence from a crime scene. Because it was. Back in the capital, we froze the fragments for transport. 2 of them had visible handwriting, water-damaged, illegible in places, but undeniably written. We sent those alongside the camera to California, where a secondary team of document restoration experts got to work. The first breakthrough came 5 weeks later. The lab reached out late one night, 1:17 a.m. My time. They'd extracted partial negatives from the film inside Jack's camera. Most of the roll was degraded beyond repair, chemical bloom, moisture erosion, light damage. But the final frames had held on, enough to make out shapes, faces, locations. They sent me the first few low-res scans with a note. "We've never seen anything like this. The images weren't staged. These weren't battlefield photos or propaganda stills. They were personal, raw, shot from inside the camp, not outside it." Jack and Daniel, emaciated, hollow-eyed, but still alive, appeared in several. In one, Jack was crouched by a tree stump holding something in his hands. It looked like a torn cloth bundle. In another, Daniel was seated with 2 other prisoners leaning in as if whispering or listening. One photo showed a group of men, backs turned, arms behind them, standing in a clearing marked by sticks in the dirt. No guards visible. No weapons. Just silence captured on film. The last image from the developed roll stunned everyone. It showed Jack again, seated cross-legged, head down, clutching what looked like a small leather-bound book. It wasn't just a camera he'd buried. It was a record. The restoration team reached out a few days later with better news. Some of the paper fragments from the rusted container had been stabilized enough to read. The handwriting matched the style on file from Jack's correspondence, tight script, careful spacing, dated entries. The language was sparse but precise. Descriptions of daily movement, guard rotations, what rations were distributed, who had died, who had been moved. One passage stood out immediately. Jack had written that they weren't just being held for leverage, they were being watched because they'd seen something. He didn't say what exactly, only that it involved MAP's high-ranking officers and operations that couldn't exist officially. He mentioned that one of the guards had slipped up referenced coordinates they weren't supposed to know. Jack suspected their camp was part of a corridor being used to coordinate cross-border movements, something that, if proven, would implicate not just guerrilla forces but state actors. He was documenting it quietly with whatever he could find. The tone of the notes shifted in the later entries. Jack sounded tired. He wrote about his weight loss, about Daniel's declining condition. He noted that they were often separated at night now. The guards were becoming more aggressive, that fewer prisoners were returning from the field when taken out. Then the final entry. If they find the film, they'll burn it. If they find the notebook, they'll shred it. But maybe one will make it through. Just one. It wasn't a message to anyone specific. It was a contingency, a long shot, a decision made by someone who knew he likely wasn't walking out of there. We released a public statement shortly after, carefully worded, just enough to confirm the discovery of historically significant materials tied to missing American journalists in Cambodia. We didn't publish the photos right away, not until we had full clearance and the families had been contacted. Carol Carver was in her late 80s by then. Her health was declining, but her mind was sharp. When we showed her the developed negatives, she just stared at them for a long time. Then she said, "I knew he'd leave something behind." I think that was the first time I realized just how much faith some people can carry, even when the world tells them not to. There was one more discovery that week. The forensic team had been testing the inner compartments of the camera body, checking for moisture and decay. Tucked beneath the pressure plate was a second roll of film, smaller, tightly wound, hidden in a cavity Jack had carved into the camera himself. It had been sealed with cloth and wax, clearly meant to outlast the rest. The lead technician said whoever hid it knew what they were doing. We hadn't seen the worst of what Jack recorded. Not yet. But we would. And when we did, it would confirm everything he tried to warn us about, and more. The second roll took longer. It had been hidden inside a hollowed compartment beneath the camera's pressure plate, sealed tight with wax, and a strip of cloth that was once part of Jack's own field bag according to the lab. It wasn't just tucked away. It was protected. The casing was rusted but intact, the film brittle from age but surprisingly dry. No light exposure, no punctures, no trace moisture. If Jack hadn't known what he was doing, it wouldn't have survived. That roll was never meant to be found easily. It was meant to survive the rest of him. The team approached it with surgical care. Each layer was logged, each movement photographed. It took nearly 3 weeks of temperature acclimation and chemical prep before they even began processing it. And when the images finally started to emerge, faint at first, then clearer with every pass, it changed the direction of everything we thought we understood. These weren't like the first set. These were colder, more deliberate, less about emotion, more about structure. Surveillance, really. Shots of the camp's perimeter angled through slats in bamboo fencing. Jack had marked distances in the margins with a dull pencil. There were maps photographed page by page, then laid against floor mats to provide scale. One image showed a series of crates being loaded onto a military truck. No insignias, but the markings were Soviet Cyrillic, stamped faintly in black across one side. Another showed what looked like a laminated document with red crosshatches, a grid system, and handwritten initials. But it was the sixth frame that pulled everything tight. A group of uniformed men, not Khmer Rouge, not Viet Cong. Their boots were clean posture formal, and 2 of them wore wristwatches American issue. They stood beside a large table beneath a canopy examining what appeared to be route diagrams. One man had his face partially turned toward the camera. The lab enhanced it carefully, frame by frame, light by light, and what came through matched a grainy ID photo from an unrelated intelligence file dated 1971. A U.S. liaison officer, supposedly withdrawn from Cambodia 6 months before that photo was taken. In his notes, Jack had written that they were not prisoners in the usual sense. He described the camp not as a detention site, but a staging post where logistics passed hands between factions that weren't supposed to be cooperating. Arms, documents, communication gear. He listed names, overheard initials, what he believed were call signs. He mentioned that their presence there, his and Daniel's, was tolerated for a time because they were seen as expendable, isolated, misinformed. But at some point they saw too much. He didn't name the exact date, just that it was raining, that they were moved out of the primary quarters and separated. After that, his entries grew sparse. Mentions of Daniel's fever, supplies being withheld, rumors of other prisoners being taken away for treatment and not returning. There was no dramatization in the writing, just the stripped-down language of someone who didn't have the energy to lie to himself anymore. One line stuck with me. It was written across the top of a page darker than the rest, as if he'd pressed harder without meaning to. This wasn't war. This was cleanup. That sentence stayed with me through every follow-up call, every translator interview, every hour spent sitting in archive rooms trying to make sense of the connections. Because the more we looked into that part of the border, the routes, the handoffs, the falsified troop withdrawals, the more we started to understand why Jack and Daniel had vanished so precisely. Not one trace left above ground. But that second roll of film wasn't just an indictment. It was also a clue. In one of the final images, cropped, angled strangely but still legible, Jack had photographed a list of names scrawled on a wooden slat wall inside a barrack. Some were Western. Others appeared local. But beside a few were crude notches, maybe to track days or movements. One of the names was marked with a V, the same letter that showed up in a long-forgotten military intake record out of Laos from 1973. A prisoner who had escaped made it to Thailand and then disappeared under protection. We tracked that lead through 3 channels, and 6 months after the photo was authenticated, we found him, living under a new name in Queensland, 71 years old. Former civilian logistics specialist, contracted in '69. He agreed to speak off the record with conditions. We sat across from each other in a small back room of a coastal church, fans clacking overhead windows open to the sea air. He didn't confirm anything directly, but when I slid a copy of the photo across the table, he looked down at it for a long time, then nodded once. He said they weren't supposed to be there, and when they were, the decision was made. No anger, no apology, just fact. He didn't know what happened to Daniel. Not exactly. But he said he'd heard the name Carver mentioned in a meeting once. Said someone referred to him as a loose end with a camera. That was when I knew Jack's footage hadn't just documented history. It had threatened it. Later that night, we received word from the excavation team still working the perimeter near the original site. They'd uncovered a second burial, shallow, degraded, but with enough structural integrity to preserve partial remains. Nearby, they found fragments of photo negatives, a melted lens housing, and a press ID card barely legible in the mud. It was Daniel Royce. They found him 49 feet from where Jack's camera had been buried, and not far from Daniel, wrapped in a plastic pouch inside a deteriorated canvas bag, they found a second notebook. Smaller, less organized. Not Jack's handwriting, just one line legible on the first page. They can bury us, but they can't bury what we saw. I didn't sleep that night, not because of grief, not even because of what had finally been confirmed, but because of what we still hadn't seen. There were still frames left undeveloped, and he'd written something in the margin of the film inventory list they recovered. A final note in fading ink barely there. Third roll given to the one they let go. That changed everything, because it meant someone else had made it out. Someone Jack had trusted with whatever he couldn't risk burying. and after 4 decades that last fragment might still be out there. We didn't know his name, not for sure, but we knew the window he came through. A Cambodian hospital manifest, dated April 1975, listed an unidentified male patient with injuries consistent with field trauma, burns, fractures, and a ruptured eardrum. Under nationality, it simply said unconfirmed foreign. That alone would have been a dead end, except the intake sheet had a note in the corner, circled in blue spoke English. American accent. Said, "Jack sent me." That was the thread we pulled. One of our partners in Phnom Penh tracked the record to a long-closed facility run by a humanitarian group that had merged with Médecins Sans Frontières in the mid-1980s. Through their archives, we found a decades-old staff ledger, mostly faded handwritten names and scattered dates, but tucked in the back was a short report from a nurse named Coralie Fisher. She'd written about a patient in spring '75 who refused to give his full name, but was adamant about one thing: he had something hidden that needed to get home. He called it the third reel. Coralie passed away in 2003, but her son Aaron kept her journals. He lived outside Marseille and agreed to meet. It took weeks to coordinate. When I finally sat across from him, just a folding table and a cup of tea between us, he slid the notebook across without ceremony. It was leather-bound, soft from age, and on the 4th page was a simple line. The boy with the injured eye asked if I could carry a promise back to someone named Anne. He said Jack would know. He cried when I said yes. Anne. That was Jack's sister. I had to sit with that for a while. There'd never been confirmation he'd tried to get a message through. But now we had a witness, someone whose mother had spoken to a man Jack likely saved who had crossed back into the world carrying something he didn't fully understand. Aaron didn't know what happened to the third roll of film. His mother never mentioned receiving it directly, but she had taken in parcels over the years, and some, she said, were never opened. After she died, he stored everything in a weatherproof container and moved it to a family property near Avignon. He hadn't looked at it in years. But now he said maybe it was time. We flew down that same week. The house was modest olive trees crowding the back wall, shutters painted a soft blue. He took me to a crawl space under the side eave. It smelled of dry stone and cedar. The box was there, still sealed, wrapped in plastic. He handed it to me without a word. Inside were a dozen envelopes, yellowed but intact. Medical supply receipts, old letters, a few faded Polaroids of patients and staff. And near the bottom, double-wrapped in foil and cotton gauze, was a roll of undeveloped 35mm film. It was labeled in Jack's handwriting. The ink was faint but legible, Set 3 Transit. We didn't process it immediately. The lab back in D.C. specialized in degraded archival media, and we knew rushing it could ruin everything. So we took photos, cataloged it, and hand-carried it home. Every checkpoint, every scan, we guarded that roll like a sealed verdict. When the images finally came through, they were darker both in tone and in clarity. Jack had shot these in motion through truck slats from behind half-closed doors in dim corridors lit by generator lights. They weren't meant to document the camp. These were about where things went next. One frame showed what looked like a transport hub, rows of crates not marked as aid, but sorted by symbol. A red triangle, a set of numbers. Another image caught the edge of a conversation between two men, one local, the other Western face, partially turned, speaking with clipped authority. But it was the last image that froze the room. It was a shot of a battered ledger open on a table. The column headers were in French. The first row listed an item tagged CRVX US, followed by a number, a shipment route, and a handwritten destination Ba-Dinh. The timing didn't line up with any known humanitarian corridor. But Ba-Dinh was a central district in Hanoi, and in '75 it was crawling with closed-door liaisons from both sides of the Cold War. And someone had moved something from that camp through the Southern River Network right to its doorstep. We brought this to the department. quietly. Not as a demand, just as a courtesy. A closed-door meeting was scheduled. I wasn't allowed to record, but I was told plainly that there would be no formal inquiry. Too many years, too many names long retired or buried. But one official, older, careful with his words, slipped me a note on the way out. It was the name of a pilot, not in military records, not in any public file. But he flew under contract out of Udorn Royal Thai Air Base in spring of '75 under a shell company that disappeared a year later. The pilot's name was Colton Avery. We found him living alone in Arizona, 86, former Bush pilot. Flew supply routes no one would claim. His memory had gaps, but the name Jack Carver made him flinch. He said he didn't know the man, but he remembered a crate, one he wasn't allowed to open, escorted by a wounded foreigner with burns on one side of his face. Said the man handed him a camera, part wrapped in cloth. Said it was insurance, and told him, "If they find me first, this goes to Anne." The part was a pressure plate from a Leica. Inside, taped behind the hinge, was a scrap of paper with a number string, 3 initials, and a phrase, "Find the ledger." Page 42. That was what cracked it open. Because the ledger had been in Vietnamese custody for decades, buried in a bureaucratic archive mislabeled as agricultural data. We got a copy through a contact in Hanoi. Page 42 listed 8 item codes, only one was legible under infrared scanning. It matched a shipment tied to a defunct embassy route through Laos. The recipient was listed only as LH. That was enough. A name appeared in our records tied to covert liaison work. Lewis Harlan, a logistics analyst who'd vanished from records in mid-1975, later confirmed as having been placed in long-term psychiatric care in Geneva. We reached out. His niece answered, said he still lived quietly, mostly silent these days, but that he sometimes spoke in numbers. And just once last year had muttered something about 2 boys who got out the truth before I could stop them. She didn't understand it. But we did, because somewhere hidden in all of this, Jack had made sure the story wouldn't be his alone. And now we weren't following shadows anymore. We were following coordinates. We traced the coordinates back to a place most maps didn't name. The terrain was broken limestone and mangrove brush tucked inland from the Mekong, a place you'd only reach if you already knew what to look for. We didn't go in alone. Through a contact in Luang Prabang, we hired a local guide, Thit, mid-40s, quiet and methodical. He'd done freelance work for French journalists during the early 90s and still remembered the older grid markers. Even with his help, it took us 2 days on foot and 1 long night camping under rain-lashed tarp before we reached the spot. There was no structure left, just the faint outline of what used to be a foundation stone blocks swallowed by the roots of a banyan tree. But beneath the central slab, we found a cavity intentional reinforced. Thit ran his hand along the edge and said it had been sealed with more care than the rest. We excavated gently, brushing away decades of silt and bark. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and buried inside a rusted ammunition crate, was a single item, a leather-bound notebook warped from heat but intact. The initials on the front were barely visible. LH. The ledger was real. We didn't open it there. Not in the rain, not with mud on our hands. We brought it back to the safe house, laid it on the table like an old relic. The binding crackled when we peeled it back. Most pages were handwritten, though some had typewritten inserts glued in, many annotated in the margins. It was a logistics log, yes, but not of supplies. It tracked people, movements, exchanges. From March to June 1975, dozens of entries listed coded names, outbound transports, payment trails, and intermediary agents. Most of the codes were unreadable, but a few had initials that matched previously scrubbed dossiers. One entry in particular stood out. May 19th. Asset JC intercepted during extraction. Compromise reported. Cleanup initiated. Package rerouted. The notation next to it was even shorter. Resolved. It was written like procedure. No emotion. No doubt. But they had logged it. Jack wasn't just collateral damage. He had been deliberately flagged, not as a casualty of chaos, but as a risk to containment. We documented every page, scanned, translated, cross-referenced. The names, where legible, mostly matched ghost identities, men and women who'd vanished from state or defense records after '75. Some had resurfaced under different names tied to think tanks, contract firms, or shadow NGOs. But a few were still alive. One remarkably still held a consulting position with a private contractor based out of Northern Virginia. We set a meeting under a pretext. I didn't go in confrontational. I just asked about Laos, about shipments, about why an aid worker might have been labeled JC in a coded file buried in a jungle no one was supposed to remember. He didn't deny it. He just looked at me and said, "You're lucky someone kept the pages. They burned the rest." That night I sent an encrypted copy of the ledger to a trusted journalist who'd worked the East Timor disclosures. She promised to run it past her editorial team, but I knew how these things went. Even if it surfaced, it would be a footnote, one more thread in a war most people had already shelved. I wasn't interested in headlines. I wanted contact. Someone from Jack's side of the line. And after weeks of silence, I got it. A call from a restricted number. The voice on the line was female, older guarded. She said her name was Annalise. She didn't confirm much, but she did say this: "He wasn't supposed to send the film. That was never the deal. But he did it anyway. He said someone back home would know what to do." I asked her how she knew Jack. She hesitated, then said I helped him leave, but not far enough. We met 3 days later in a library outside Boston. She wore a scarf and dark glasses, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd been an interpreter during the war, seconded from a Canadian relief organization, but had run parallel work for an unofficial U.S. liaison group. Her job was to maintain channels, not to ask questions. Jack, she said, had come to her with the film after realizing a courier he trusted had gone silent. He told her if something happened, the reel had to make it back to Ann Carver. He believed that if the film reached the States, it could trigger enough of a trail to unravel what was happening. Annalise had agreed, but she was never able to confirm it made it past the border. She'd been detained herself not long after held in quarantine, then quietly repatriated through Bangkok under medical clearance. When she tried to follow up, every name she reached out to was either gone or had never existed on paper. But she still had something in a address book Jack had scribbled in during their last meeting. Names, numbers, one of them underlined twice Harlan. I showed her the ledger. She nodded once and said, "That man never wanted to be found. If you found him, then Jack won." It didn't feel like a win. That night, back at my apartment, I sat with Jack's final photo again, the one of the ledger. Not just what it revealed, but how he framed it. Not dead center. Not composed like the others. The focus was off just slightly, as if he'd taken it fast. But in the top corner, something stood out I hadn't noticed before. A cigarette pack, hand-rolled, with a symbol scrawled on it in pen. It was the same symbol from the flag sewn inside his bag, the one recovered in '75, a triangle made of 3 broken arrows. We had always assumed it was a personal marker, maybe a code between brothers, but it wasn't. Annalise confirmed it was an unofficial signal used by a splinter group of medical couriers, those who smuggled not weapons but evidence. That symbol, she said, meant one record remains. And now I had to find out what it was. I never found the final reel. I searched for it longer than I care to admit. Through back channels, shuttered archives, whispered names in embassies that no longer flew a flag. I followed the symbol across provinces and decades until the trail ended, not with a locked door, but with a silence no one would break. The last record, if it ever existed, was buried deeper than any ledger Jack left behind. But maybe that was the point. Maybe what he gave us was already the last record, not of the war, but of one man's refusal to let truth vanish without a witness. Annalise passed 6 months after we met. I found out through a mailed envelope no return address, just a clipping from a local obituary and a photo I'd never seen before. Jack and Annalise side by side, both smiling, standing in front of a wooden radio tower with mountains in the background. It was dated May 17th, 1975, 2 days before he was taken. On the back, she'd written, "He knew the risk, but he wanted the story to outlive the silence." I think about that often, how some people vanish into history and others try to write their way back out. Jack didn't do what he did for headlines. He wasn't chasing exposure. He was trying to make sure anyone saw what had been done before the ash settled. And somewhere along the way, I stopped chasing the real and started carrying the weight of the record myself. The box sits on a shelf in my study now. The ledger, the fragments, the restored film, even the broken camera. I keep them not as artifacts, but as proof. Not proof of conspiracy or revenge, but of care, of effort, of someone trying to hold a light steady in a place designed to swallow it whole. I met Ann Carver once, Jack's friend from the university, the one he'd named in his notes. She never knew what happened to him, had always assumed he'd either defected or died quietly. When I showed her the film, she cried, but not the way you'd expect. She said, "He really did go back, didn't he? Even after they warned him." He did, and in some ways he never left. There's not much more to say. Not that hasn't already been said by the evidence he risked everything to leave behind. But if you've listened this far, if you stayed through every frame, every name, every quiet admission, then you've done something he would have wanted. You bore witness. You carried a name forward. And maybe that's all some people ever ask of the rest of us. If this story stayed with you, share it. Not for views, not for headlines, but so someone else remembers Jack Flynn. So someone else says his name. Because after all the digging, the dead ends, the lost reels, and rewritten files, that may be the one thing they can't erase.